Last year, I attended a conference in New Orleans. And after the conference one evening, I was in the French Quarter walking down Bourbon Street on the way to dinner with some colleagues. Just then, a man seemed to pop up out of the crowd right in front of me. He pulled out a $5 bill and he said, "I bet you $5 I can tell you where you got your shoes and even what street you got your shoes on." Well, luckily for me, someone had tried this exact same con on me over 20 years before, the last time I was in New Orleans. I'd waited 20 years for this exact moment. So I said to him, "How about I tell you, I got my shoes on my feet and I got my feet on Bourbon Street. Now, can I have that $5?" Smiling and shaking his head, he said, "Aw, man," and he pocketed the $5 and he melted back into the crowd. Unfortunately, just like me in New Orleans, we've all encountered someone who's tried to con, lie, deceive, hoodwink, bamboozle, dupe, scam, bilk, or fleece us at one time or another in our lives. But fortunately, English has some wonderful words to describe liars and the lies they tell. So in this lecture, I'll introduce you to 9 powerful words to describe the cheats, swindlers, charlatans, scam artists, barracudas, sharks and sharpies, and all their swindles, hustles, flimflams, and double dealings. So let's start by discussing 2 types of tricksters we've all encountered in our lives: mountebanks and sophists. Okay, imagine this. You can't sleep, so you're up late watching TV again, channel surfing while munching a bag of potato chips, and you come upon an infomercial on channel 723. Now the salesman seems a bit too slick for you. He claims he's a doctor, and he's giving you the hard sell on an extract from a root of a plant that you've never even heard of. He says the plant is only found in some remote location in the Amazon River basin. And he claims that it will cure everything from migraines to stomach aches to low testosterone levels. Needless to say, you're skeptical of this self-proclaimed expert's extravagant claims. Well, there is a wonderful word for this type of fast-talking con man who sells quack remedies: a mountebank. Mountebank is a flamboyant swindler, a flimflammer, someone who claims to be an expert but really isn't. Mountebanks often claim to be doctors, but they can just as easily claim to be any other type of expert. However, don't be fooled. Underneath their authentic appearances, they're frauds and imposters. Okay, here's the word mountebank used in context. Our town was completely duped by the slick-talking imposter who breezed into town, claimed to be a physician, and sold us his quack remedies. We didn't realize he was a mountebank of the first order until after he left and we found his cure-alls were complete shams. Now, as with so many words, the etymology of the word mountebank can help us remember its meaning. Mountebank comes from an Italian phrase meaning to mount a bench and refers to a quack doctor or swindler who would enter a town, mount a bench in the public square so the crowd could better see and hear him, get it? And try to sell his fake potions to a susceptible public. So, to remember mountebank, picture a fake doctor standing or mounted on a bench, trying to hawk his counterfeit elixirs. And I want you to highlight the mount in mountebank in your vocabulary notebook. If you remember mount as your key word in mountebank, you won't forget its meaning. Now, you might even want to draw a quick sketch of a doctor on a bench in your vocabulary notebook next to the word mountebank. Just a stick figure with the label doctor will do. What matters is that the image triggers the word's meaning for you. Okay, so let's make a personal connection. Take a moment and think of a mountebank you have encountered in your own life. Someone who's made extravagant claims trying to sell you something that didn't quite live up to the billing. Write down this personal experience next to the word mountebank in your notebook. Remember, making personal connections to word meanings will help you to store these words in your lexicon, your mental library of words, so you can use them later in conversation and writing. Now, synonyms for mountebank include charlatan, con artist, one I like, flim-flammer, conniver, and shyster. Now, our second word refers to a different type of trickster. Not one trying to sell you a counterfeit product, like a mountebank, but someone trying to sell you a counterfeit argument. Now, I want you to think back to a time you've watched a political debate, okay? The first politician begins to construct her argument, and it's compelling, and it's starting to sway you to that politician's side. Then the second politician begins to rebut the first politician's argument, poking holes in her reasoning, demonstrating how she played fast and loose with the facts. Now, at this point in the debate, the veil is lifted from your eyes, and you realize that this first politician was intentionally trying to deceive you with her verbal gymnastics. This first politician, who intentionally tried to pull the wool over your eyes, is a sophist. S-O-P-H-I-S-T. A sophist is a noun referring to one skilled in elaborate and devious argumentation. Sophists engage in clever arguments, specifically designed to persuade or convince others, not caring how sound or logical the arguments are, but trying to win the arguments with the splitting of words. Okay, let's try sophist in context. The debate team failed to win when the judges saw through their clever but unsound arguments and pegged them as the sophists that they were. Now, sophistry is a related word you will encounter that refers to the act of intentionally attempting to deceive someone with tricky, intellectually dishonest arguments. Sophist comes from the Greek root S-O-P-H, soph, meaning wise, and skilled, clever. For sophists, the emphasis is not on the wise, it's on the skilled and particularly the clever. The sophists were professional, itinerant teachers in ancient Greece who taught, among other things, rhetoric, or the art of persuasive speaking and writing. Now, these sophists were known for their clever, but not necessarily logical arguments. Their detractors claim that sophists weren't on a journey to find the truth. They were simply trying to persuade others by any argumentative trick or intellectual sleight of hand that would enable them to win. So in this light, you can see how sophist became a term of contempt. Being called a sophist is most definitely not a compliment. Okay, so now what other related words do you already know that also begin with the S-O-P-H root? How about sophomore? A sophomore contains the same Greek root and literally means wise, fool. Sophos means wise, and moros means foolish, and is the root from which the word moron is derived. Now, because sophomores have been in school just long enough to think that they know it all, some consider wise or clever fools an apt description for a sophomore. Okay, we just used the related word strategy, another powerful strategy for your vocabulary toolbox that's based on the spelling, meaning, connection. When you encounter or learn a new, unfamiliar word, I want you to try and connect it with a word you already know that's spelled the same and or that sounds the same. Now, we're going to use this related words strategy a lot in this course. So the next time you hear the word sophist, think of the initial part, S-O-P-H, in the word sophomore, which means wise and clever. And you'll remember that sophists were clever, tricky debaters and persuaders. Okay, we've just discussed two types of deceivers who don't always tell the whole truth, mountebanks and sophists. Now, what can we call the arguments and claims made by mountebanks and sophists? Let's explore three words for untrue claims and stories. Now, as we've seen, sophists can be described as clever debaters who attempt to deceive you with plausible but unfounded arguments. So what might we call the type of argument delivered by a sophist? An argument that looks plausible on the surface, but that is actually fallacious underneath. The answer is our next target word, specious. Now, specious is an adjective that means having the ring of truth or plausibility, but actually fallacious. Specious claims appear plausible, but they're actually false. Specious is often used to describe arguments that aren't simply false. They are, and this is the important distinction, deceptively plausible. Arguments that look good on the surface, but really aren't when you analyze them and try to follow the chain of reasoning. They are intentionally misleading. So, the next time you see or hear a politician trying to persuade you with an argument that is deceptively plausible, but plays fast and loose with the facts, you can impress your friends by saying, "That sophist sure is spewing forth specious arguments. I won't trust another word he says." Now, specious comes from the Latin speciosus, meaning good-looking, which comes from species, meaning appearance. So a specious argument is an argument that appears or looks good on the surface, but really isn't. And specious is also related to a Latin root we've already explored, spec, meaning look. So to remember this word's meaning, I want you to highlight the spec in specious in your vocabulary notebook and connect it to the root spec, meaning look. You could also draw a picture of spectacles, our key word for spec, to remind you that specious arguments look good, but aren't. Now also remember, one of our principles of vocabulary learning, chunking. Chunking words that are semantically related or related by meaning. It's kind of like a library. If we store all our vocabulary words or books by the same meaning or topic, it's much easier to find these words when we need them. So, think of the target words sophist and specious together. A sophist delivers specious or misleading arguments. Okay, our next target word is spurious. Spurious is often used as a synonym for specious, but it actually has a slightly different connotation. Now, of course, there is no such thing as an exact synonym in English. If two words meant exactly the same thing, we wouldn't need them both, would we? Now, spurious is an adjective that means not genuine or authentic, false. So, like specious, spurious can refer to something like an argument or claim that is false, not genuine. So, what's the main difference between specious and spurious? Okay, now I warn you, it is not a clear-cut black and white difference in meaning, but rather a difference in emphasis. And here it is. Specious clearly implies fraud and intentional deception. Spurious does not necessarily imply fraud or intentional deception. So, a spurious argument could be false and misleading, but it could also be a false argument that's just an honest mistake. Now, in contrast to that, specious arguments are definitely intended to deceive you. Okay? So to sum up the differences, if you want to emphasize that a false argument looked good, but was intentionally misleading, specious would be the better choice. If you want to emphasize that a false argument or claim is obviously false or was an honest mistake, spurious would probably be the better choice. Okay, now this brings me to collocates. Collocates are words that commonly occur together. They are co-located next to each other. So, what words would you likely see specious and spurious used with? What common phrases might you hear them used in? Well, you might hear of a specious argument, or you might hear of spurious reasoning in a political debate, or of spurious charges in a high-profile court case. Argument, reasoning, charges. These are collocates with our target words. So, write these collocates and common phrases down in your vocabulary notebook. Identifying collocates is very helpful in learning vocabulary. When you want to go out and actually use a target word, it's really helpful to know what other words the target word is often used with. Remember, words live in context, so it makes sense to study them in context. Okay, our next target word is apocryphal.